asking us to try to understand the world in which we live. So we're trying to understand it from a point of view of faith and from the point of view of being citizens. About the silence, to think about those questions, to enter into discussion about them. I'm really pleased to welcome you here in person this evening, and I'm also pleased to tell you that this lecture is being live streamed through our YouTube channel. We're very grateful to our donors who have given us financial support to permit this to happen and to permit us to bring in speakers.
Is Father Rob here? There he is. So Father Rob, as you probably know, is the pastor of this parish, and we just grabbed a few beers before this talk. And he's also a scientist. He's a lab scientist and experimentalist. He also has a degree in philosophy. Now, the reason why this is important isn't just to brag about your credentials, Father, but it's also about the fact that the Roman Catholic Church has seen it as significant enough to require all of its priests to acquire an undergraduate degree in philosophy before they study theology. To me, the before matters maybe as much as the the fact that they have to do it, the fact that it's seen as an antecedent to theology. So my claim, and in some sense my mission within here in my role, my teaching role at the college, is to really promote an idea of philosophy that is complementary to theology, but in a, you could say, in an antecedent way, in a perhaps more elementary way. If I can just for now make one last claim before I move on to point B, I don't mean this to mean like dumbed down philosophy, because I think it can sometimes come off that way. And I have 3 stories to share with you about how I learned this distinction between simplicity and oversimplification. They come from 3 realms. One is philosophy, one is theology, and the other one is fishing. The one from philosophy finds me as an undergraduate at Franciscan University. This carries me forward a bit further into my first teaching appointment, and this is my fishing story. I have lots of fishing stories, but this is just one of them. I was 27 whenever I started my position there, so I was pretty young, and I got confused for college students a lot. And in many ways, I was closer to my students' age than I was to my colleagues. And so, we became very friendly, and it was a really have a wonderful relationships to them, even to this day. And one of the students was a track runner, and our track team was going to the nationals, so they had to stay a little bit after the term was over. So they were just staying on campus at Wabash College. And one of my students loved to fish, and I love to fish. I love to fish. My grandfather, the shepherd, we fished all through the mountains that he herded sheep through all my life. So he said, Dr. Rocha, I hear that you said you used to fish for trout with your grandfather. Oh yeah. He's like, well, they're going to release some trout in this very particular area. It's only about 35 minutes from here. Would you like to go? And I was like, are you kidding me? What time? Well, we have to get a trout stamp and, we'll get going. Okay. All right. So we go and we arrive at this kind of park area, and we descend and we go by, and we're walking up this stream looking for a place to fish. And we find a little pool just full of crappie. So we caught our limit of crappie and kept going. And we get to that kind of point in which the literal tributaries and creeks and puddles start to coalesce, and there's a clear wing here and another wing comes there, and then it all hits together, and then the rapids slow down and you could see the trout rising, and we're like, okay, this is the place. And obviously it was the place, because above us, smarter people were fishing from a pier that was up there that we didn't know about. So we get into the water, and I'm wearing, it's the middle of the summer, I'm wearing a cut-off t-shirt and in shorts in the water. So I don't exactly look the part of a professor. And my student is doing the same thing. And after a while, an older gentleman starts to meander his way down the hill next to us to get into the stream. And at first I'm a little worried about him, because I was worried that, didn't want to fall down. But he clearly knew what he was doing. He got into the stream. He tied on a lure. He started to fish. And there comes that social moment when you kind of have to look at each other and kind of recognize that you're all there. And so we look, and okay, that's fine. A little bit later, we keep fishing, and my new friend over here says, where are y'all from? And that was a clear recognition that we weren't from around there, and that's fine. So we said, Wabash. And that was universally understood that we were from the college. And, oh, okay, great. We checked out. Fish a little bit longer, no fish. He says, what do y'all do at Wabash? And in my head, I'm like, oh boy, I'm going to get found out. This is going to I'll have to explain. And so I let my student go first. He goes, I study political science. Oh, okay. And I tried to just be quiet and ignore him, but he didn't let me off the hook. How about you? Oh, I'm a teacher. I teach. And he looks at me really long, like, okay, so what do you teach? Well, I teach philosophy. And I'm like, oh boy, here we go. If you've ever said you teach philosophy at a bar before, you get usually the same retort. Someone says, oh yeah, I took a psychology course one time. I hated that, Or you get or someone says, oh really? That's cool, man. Tell me like the most philosophy thing you know. It's always like, I don't know, So I'm getting ready for him to say one of these two things. And so I say, I teach philosophy. But his response caught me completely off guard. Like that. He said, are you any good at it? This struck me as a serious question, right? This wasn't just someone, some drunk making, weird comments about your field. This was serious. My mind raced back to Socrates and just walking around the city of Athens asking weird questions, and I was like, oh boy, this deserves a good answer. And so I thought about it a bit, and he was kind of looking at me like, all right, see what this young kid says to me. And I said, well, sir, if you ever meet a philosopher or someone who teaches philosophy, and if they tell you they're any good at it, they're probably not very good at it. And he just smiled at me, and he goes, I can get that. So we went on fishing, and, he ended up catching a trout. We didn't. He gave us his trout. He must have felt bad for us. And we went on our way. These three stories about philosophy, theology, and fishing are probably all fairly unspectacular. They don't involve any isms or ologies. They're told in story. They're not told through citation or through authority. But it's really actually the fact that these stories and numerous other stories that I won't go on and on with are really the core of what I mean further by this idea of love of wisdom for shepherds and sheep. And it's in particular in the realm of this kind of storytelling and these kind of anticlimactic moments where I actually believe not just pastoral philosophy, but where the most serious philosophy we find happens. Socrates was a strange fellow walking the streets of Athens, asking people questions, being sought out to ask questions. His student Plato decided to write plays. I mean, it's not the most obvious idea, right? Let's write plays, right? He wrote plays about these conversations. Classicists argue whether they're plays or whether they're transcriptions, and I'm not a classicist, I don't know. But throughout time, especially when we enter into the church and we find, the bishops, they have a style of writing, but if you read the early church, I mean, these letters are hilarious. The bishops are fighting in the open. They're calling each other names. They're making analogies to things in Roman pagan society that are sometimes really funny if you have a classicist next to explain the joke to you. They're having a rather ordinary, unspectacular conversation about Christology, about Trinitarian theology, about some of the most basic core tenets of Christianity, right? And so my claim is that pastoral philosophy is not just a sort of like philosophy for normal people, which obviously means like philosophy for dummies, but that in fact the real work of philosophy, most proper to the Greeks, to the tradition of philosophy, is precisely this kind of shepherding, sheeping philosophy. And that this is, in fact, you might say, the kind of philosophy that the professional philosophers can't do. I mean, I'm amazed and shocked, and I thank you. You all came here for no grades. What are you doing? Don't you know you're not supposed to, classes are for credentials and credentials are for jobs or pay raises, and you're doing this all wrong. I'm sorry. But this is what makes pastoral philosophy in a particular way, I don't want to overextend this, pure, right? I've had the advantage and the real blessing on behalf with St. Mark's to go into church basements. Many of you have been there, and talk to people about atheism for 3 weeks, or talk to people about my weird ideas about education and schooling, and some people come and go. Some people decide not to come back, and that's fine. That's what makes it in some sense pure, right? But that's another angle of pastoral philosophy. And so I need to make some disclaimers, because I'm sure some of you came here for a much more spectacular performance, a much more maybe formal philosophical endeavor here. Maybe some of you were like, no, okay, well, good, thank you. First of all, I am not an art historian. I don't know anything about these things up here in the way an art historian knows. And I don't really know much in general, like information-wise, facts-wise. I'm terrible at Jeopardy. I'm not good at trivia. I'm not very good at alphabetizing things. I don't have really anything very sophisticated, in terms of names and dates. And I might even get a few wrong, and you'll correct me, and that'll be fine. Pastoral philosophy isn't really concerned, I would claim, first and foremost with facts or with trivia or with information. It's really looking to get at something a bit different. In fact, I would claim altogether different. So I'm going to talk about art today. I'm going to talk about God. I'm going to talk about this way of beauty thing. But I'm not going to try to be systematic about this. I don't believe these are 3 separate things that then need to be brought into a whole. I don't believe that there's this perfect oneness that I can pull a perfect thread out of and expose to you. I'm simply going to try as best as I can and as I'm able to think with you, hopefully, about these themes in a way that may be familiar to you. And insofar as it's unfamiliar, perhaps that might help us think about things as well. But this is just thinking. It's not anything beyond that. And so I may use a few words here and there that sound kind of big. Feel free to ask me what in the world they mean. They're not technical in that sense. So let's move on to the second part. Hopefully now we understand what in the world a pastoral philosopher is. It's an unspectacular philosopher who gives disclaimers and tells weird stories as a way to try to think about ideas as plainly and as obviously as he can. And in some delusion thinks that this is sort of what real education is and what Socrates did, and is trying to emulate that. Have you heard the joke about the difference between the prophet and the madman? What's the difference between the prophet and the madman? Does anyone know? Time. So on to point 2, a poet, a pianist, and a friend of Borges walk into the Vatican. Next question. Who knows who those 3 people are? Does anybody pick it up? Don't cheat. Justin, you can't say. Who is the poet, the pianist, and the friend of Borges? I'll give it away. The poet is John Paul II. The pianist is Benedict XVI. And the friend of Borges is Francis. So kind of a tricky way to bring them up, but I think you'll see a little bit of why when I move in. So I'm just going to talk very straightforwardly about these 3 popes, and then I'm going to move really into looking very closely at the pianist. The poet, John Paul II. I realize that John Paul II's project, or I'm in Canada, project, right, is very much emphasized through things like his Wednesday lectures that have become Theology of the Body, a great number of his encyclicals, obviously. Many of his papal teachings remain and constitute really the core of, I guess, his memory in the church. My claim here is, though, without taking anything away from those documents, that those documents are really incomplete if we don't understand first who John Paul II was, in particular in the Krakowian literary tradition. John Paul II is, even for people who are not Catholics and could care less about his social teachings, respect and recognize his contribution to literature, right? I had the great honor to see a very secular play troupe perform The Jeweler's Shop in Minneapolis. I was blown away. It's really a spectacular work to read. It's much more spectacular to see live. What's interesting about it is that John Paul II's approach to drama, and in this case dramaturgy, is really truly poetic in the sense that when you read The Jeweler's Shop, you realize that even the composition, the structure of the lines and the stanzas is highly irregular. There's no clear line vertical. It's running from side to side and from place to place. And it's clear that John Paul II is a poet first and a playwright, you could say, almost by accident. In fact, he almost even alludes to that in the subtitle. A lot of people know about him as an actor, but I would say that really the core identity of John Paul II is really his poetic sensibility. And this poetic sensibility marries to his intellectual curiosity about this really big word alert, phenomenology. Phenomenology is a word that just means the study of appearances. Phenomena are things that appear. Ology is the study of. Phenomenology was founded, though, in Europe and in Central Europe as, in some sense, a uniquely secular response to modern philosophy. And John Paul II was aware of this in many ways, and he was endeared to it, I think, deeply because of the sense that poets understand, I think, at a very deep level, that things appear to our consciousness in a way that is in some sense uniquely one. We can't share poetry, you could say, universally, even though what might be shared by the poetry are universals. But those universals come to us through the dignity of our personhood, one by one by one by one. And so John Paul II entered into the Curia and into the Vatican, where to this day, we can just say phenomenology isn't the main way that theologians or philosophers operate. Thomism, the system of Aquinas, is. And a lot of John Paul II's project was to, in some sense, reconcile these apparent differences between, you could say, the hard line of Thomism and the softer line of phenomenology in a way that could uncover some aspects that perhaps had been missed. So Theology of the Body is a speculative, week-by-week project trying to show the rigor of the Thomistic project put into dialogue with, you could say, the sensitivity, even the poetic sensitivity of the phenomenological school. Did he accomplish that? That's not really my area. It's not my place to say. However, my claim or conjecture would be that whatever he didn't accomplish of that project theologically or philosophically, his literary works speak to the fact that there was something clearly accomplished that really can't really be questioned. One more thing about John Paul II. Many people believe that he stopped doing literature and plays and activism and all that stuff when he got serious and got appointed a cardinal and all that stuff. It couldn't be any more false. John Paul II wrote poetry throughout his life. He never compartmentalized himself. And in fact, his final collection of poetry, which I have cited here in the resources on the backside, are really quite beautiful in a very simple way. They're very unadorned. They're very kind of obvious. And the references are very rich. And the commentary on those verses is by Joseph Ratzinger, the pianist. My primary aim today, aside from hopefully thinking with you about art, God, and the way of beauty, is to really make a case that the legacy of Pope Benedict has been deeply misunderstood, not just in light of the papacy of Francis, but even just on the terms of Benedict. So I just want to clear up some basic factoids. First of all, Benedict is not a Thomist. He was not trained in the school of Aquinas. He's not a Dominican. That's not his training. He wrote his dissertation on another person at the University of Paris, across the hall, we might say, from Aquinas, named Bonaventure, a Franciscan, a much more Neoplatonic thinker, a person with a much more poetic sensibility. And Benedict XVI was always a great lover of the arts, but unlike Pope John Paul II, who was an artist, he really became, I would say, a philosopher of aesthetics and a theologian of aesthetics. He became very interested in what art is and what beauty is. And his approach was not always systematic, as we see in his commentaries on John Paul II's poetry. It's imaginative, it's highly allegorical and analogical. It is deeply sensitive, you could say, to the objective and the subjective elements of literature, of verse, of rhythm, of movement, of illusion, of image. All these things are present, I would say, across Benedict's work. And his papacy, I would say, is in fact, well, that's very much the next section, but it's radical for even other reasons. But I just want to show by this very simple fact that Benedict was not the antithesis to John Paul II. He was very much a neighbor. We could say Augustine. There's room, I think, to suggest that Augustine was one of, and he was an Augustinian, and he is an Augustinian, I'm sorry. I wish him a long life. That this Augustinian, Franciscan, Bonaventurian sensibility of Benedict XVI really shows us, I think, the vast riches of his idea. The other thing about Benedict, and this cannot be ignored, and it'll come up a bit later, is that he was German. And by German, I mean, you can't be a German philosopher and stop reading philosophy at Aquinas. A lot happened in Germany in philosophy. Kant, Hegel, German idealism, Nietzsche. Benedict was not ignorant of these schools of thought, was not ignorant of them, and as a German, I would say, was not outside of the realm of being in many ways influenced by some of these sensibilities. And they come out even in his speculations on music and art. If you read Nietzsche on Schopenhauer, on Wagner and stuff, and you read Benedict, it's striking the Germanness of that particular sense of things. So that's the pianist. We'll hear a lot more about him. Third, the friend of Borges. I am Texican, which is a complicated thing to be, but let's just call it Mexican for now. A lot of cultures have this, though. You know how, like, if someone knows your friend, they're like your best friend? Does anybody know that kind of thing? Where, like, one really... So this is what I mean by a friend of Borges, because I don't want to deceive you. Pope Francis, whenever he was teaching literature, by the way, he's trained as a chemist, but he taught literature in his 20s. He, an Argentine, reached out to Borges through Borges's secretary, who used to be Francis's piano teacher, and got Borges to read some work of his students that Borges ended up liking, and ended up actually writing the introduction to a small collection of Francis's students' works of literature, short stories in particular. Borges, though, is probably not the person you hear about first in a Catholic lecture on art and aesthetics. I mean, Borges is a difficult character in some senses. But I think this shows you, again, the worldliness of Benedict, the worldliness of John Paul II, and clearly the worldliness that we're all kind of familiar with at this point of Francis, but in particular, the worldliness of his sensibilities coming out of the arts. And Francis, unlike John Paul II, the artist, and unlike Benedict, the aesthete, the philosopher of aesthetics, the theologian of aesthetics, is truly just a lover of art. He doesn't seem to be as interested in what art is and what beauty is and these kinds of questions. And he's not himself he won't be remembered in the literary canon the way John Paul II is. But if you look on the second page to Francis commenting on his favorite artists, I had to edit this down just to fit it on the page. He goes on and on and on, and not just the sort of names everyone's heard of, but details. Like, I like so-and-so in this way, but I like so-and-so in that way. And so-and-so speaks to me here, but doesn't speak to me there. And, I mean, he gives a very rich sense that here is a man who has been really shaped and formed, and his conscience has been really built around a steady and heavy regimen of art. And we're talking Fellini and cinema, we're talking Mozart and music, we're talking many things. And in particular, of course, the pedagogical elements of how he taught literature. I didn't get to put in his definition of the classics, but it's not the classic definition of the classics. It's pretty much attached to generational memory. Francis claims something is a classic if the old people, the middle-aged people, and the young people all know about it at the same time. I like that. Yet, he shows how whenever he was supposed to teach El Cid, one of the great Spanish works of literature, that his students didn't want to read it. So he said, well, let's compromise a bit. What do you like to read? And so then they read other things. And so here we see a relationship between the classics, even on Francis's understanding, and that. So I don't want to say that he's not an artist, not an aesthete, but his appreciation for art, I think, is a little bit more practical, a little bit more down to earth, and very and deeply experiential. He's just someone who has been brought up, you could say, on a diet of a heavy diet of art. So those are the three people I wanted to mention. And obviously the whole walk in the Vatican is me trying to make a bad joke about the so-and-so, such and such, and so-and-so walk into a bar, right? And I didn't think I could get away with the bar part. But so now the third section, the pianist walks out. And this is where I really want to dig into Benedict and make, in a much more aggressive way perhaps, the case that Benedict's papacy has been thoroughly misunderstood by leaving out some, in my mind, fairly obvious details. So the idea of the exit of Benedict hopefully is very clear. I don't know what we mean by radical, and we can argue about, well, the etymology of the word radical goes back to roots and radis, and so maybe conservatives are radical. I don't care so much about the semantics of the word. We get the sense that radical means something that hasn't been done before, something new, something unprecedented. And many people use this word to describe Francis. And I would say, for some good reason, Francis doesn't write like a radical. He's constantly citing authority. He's constantly saying, so-and-so, such and such, and so-and-so 5 times over said this, but I'm just going to say it again because it's timely. But, okay, maybe Francis is a radical. I kind of think he is. But Benedict quit. He just stopped being Pope one day. I don't know what you mean by radical. But Benedict XVI did something that literally, historically, just doesn't get done for like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years at a time within the history of the church. Now that's fairly superficial. You could say, oh, if that's radical, then you don't understand radical. I probably don't. But the way he resigned, I think here is really important. And this is going to kind of get us into the more substantive aspects. This is going to be a look towards C, but I just want to show you it while I have your attention. Benedict XVI on his conscientious exit from the papacy. If you haven't read the Declaratio of Benedict that he gave to the cardinals, it is a moving paragraph. Because it's a paragraph where Benedict really makes it clear to the cardinals that I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm doing it. And I know that you might think any number of things, but I'm doing it anyway because I have, in my own conscience, formed this view and this belief, and I'm going to carry it out. And I'm also just not going to tell you a whole lot about it in terms of like the, journalistic details. We can see in that little quote where he says, having repeatedly examined my conscience before God with full freedom, I declare that I renounce the ministry of Bishop of Rome, successor of Peter. That's radical. Can you imagine sitting there, not expecting this, like awkward, right? I mean, it's just kind of, whoa. And he leaves no room for doubt. He reemphasizes his conscience and the role of freedom in his decision. And this particular way of quitting, this particular way of exiting, this particular renunciation is precisely what I want to point to in terms of this question of art. But let's go up to A, Eros. Benedict XVI, I want to claim, has done something probably more unprecedented in his teaching on love that we can find most featured in his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, God is Love. In particular, the first section of that very short encyclical, the section, I believe, which is on the unity of love in creation and in salvation history. Let's go back a bit. Plato, as we all hopefully know and understand, wasn't Catholic or Christian or any of those things. Yet, Augustine, whenever he's writing Civitatis Dei, City of God, he's, heresy here, heresy there, heresy there, heresy there. Plato, stop. Augustine kind of, in the fullest way, really redeems, you could say, the Platonic tradition, and instead of calling it out for heresy, says, no, this is a prefigurement of our concept of the soul, of all these things. If you read Paul, whenever he's in the book of Acts and he's speaking to the Athenians, he doesn't talk to them about Jesus. He talks to them about the soul. Why? Because Plato of Athens kind of wrote the book on the soul. I mean, how many times does Socrates questions about the soul? So Augustine, you could say, Christianized Plato, not in a sense in which he took Plato out of his element, but in some sense, Augustine submits Christianity to Platonism in a very real way. Origen did too. Maybe he went too far. Not the place to talk about that. But Augustine really does this in a big way. Later on, we find Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas' system is built on the foundations of Aristotle. The Aristotle that was lost from the West, that was preserved in the Arabic-speaking world, and that came up through us through Spain and kind of caught us by surprise. If you've heard the expression transubstantiation, which I kind of hope you have if you happen to be Catholic, substance, on the other side of substance is accident, we're right in Aristotelian categories. Aquinas, not through a declaration, but through a usage of the Aristotelian system, also, you could say, Christianizes Aristotle in an, I would say, equally radical way. Aristotle was seen through Averroes' Islamic philosophy as a threat to Christendom, and all of a sudden Aquinas, instead of fighting, kind of gives in and rewrites, you could say, the very kind of the rigor and the scholastic kind of ability to kind of really press out distinctions and build this powerful system that most of theology today seems to be working on, at least in the mainstream. My claim today is that Benedict has done the same thing again. And if we read Deus Caritas Est very closely, or not even that closely actually, if you read it and you look for, hey, who's the first person who might not be a Christian, you're going to find the name of a philosopher by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. We've probably heard of his name before. Benedict points out that Nietzsche critiques Christianity for destroying eros. And Benedict is very subtle on this point. He clearly engages Nietzsche and says, this claim is wrong. However, he only engages the critique, but he doesn't disengage from the fact that there is a sense in which the Christian tradition has overlooked eros, because as he looks for the etymology, says the Old Testament only uses a word kind of like eros twice. The New Testament doesn't use it at all. Paul uses the word agape, and he shows very closely why it would be the case that maybe eros would get kind of put by the wayside. But Benedict, rather than saying, no, Nietzsche's wrong, eros is, subsumed under agape, Benedict turns and pivots and redeems eros in such a radical way where he puts agape under, you could say, the logic of eros. Now, if you want to read a really short version of this, read his Lenten reflection of 2007, which he delivered in Rome in 2006 on November 13th, where he goes even further to claim that what he calls the mad eros of the cross is the sublimation of God's agape for the world. Now, I kind of made a big deal of of Benedict leaving the papacy and how he said it and how he did it. And it was dramatic, and I think you got the point. But I am of the view that this work that Benedict did to not only rehabilitate eros, but to even extend it into the realm of Pauline agape is, thank you so much, as radical as anything we could find since Augustine and Aquinas. It is my view that Benedict will be a church father someday, even just for this one insight he's given to us. This is important because it gets us to the question of art. Benedict, when he writes on art, does so in many ways, but the place where he writes on art that I find it most interesting is in a very short book right here. Oh, I'm supposed to be using these as props. Obviously, I'm not a PowerPoint guy, but, okay, here. On to the last book. This little tiny book is a book called On Conscience. It was written when he was a cardinal. And he's engaging on the question of conscience, really working from Newman forward. It's impressive to me that whenever Benedict talks about art, in one tiny paragraph, he says this about art. And he's not talking about art writ large, he's talking about the work of art. He says, what a work of art says is indifferent. It can glorify God or the devil. The sole standard is that of formal technical mastery. End quote. My claim just to try and clarify this, you might disagree, is that Benedict seems to recognize the radical freedom of the work of art to say absolutely nothing. Now, Benedict goes on to clarify that it's precisely this sort of radical freedom of art that requires a conscience to in some sense, control it, really, and not let it just go in any crazy direction. My point, though, is before we get to the question of conscience, that we really just stop and think about what it is he just said about art. That art is uncontrollable. That art has no end in itself that we can figure out. That art can't be absolutized or dogmatized or put into this, that, or the other. That art is, in some sense, a kind of eros when we think about what eros means. Eros, long-standing, has meant sort of the uncontrollable. That's why people don't like it, right? Because it's just out of control. You can't predict it. It's Dionysian, and this, that, and the other. This quality of art, this internal freedom of art, this erotic understanding of art is, first of all, if you've read Nietzsche, very Nietzschean, very German. And it's not just Nietzsche, and it goes way further into German idealism and to Hegel and to a lot of other things. But what it also is in my mind, it's what might serve as the foundation for Benedict's radical renunciation of the papacy. Let's reread what Benedict says to the cardinals in light of his, in my opinion, groundbreaking understanding of eros and its relationship, even its ordering relationship to agape, and his understanding of art as being, you could say, beyond the scope of scrutiny, beyond the scope of ethics, beyond the scope of justice, beyond all these things. By the way, if those things sound crazy, Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics says, among friends, there's no need for justice, right? So we find art in that Aristotelian realm, beyond the realm of justice, beyond the law, right? Let's reread Benedict and let's reconsider what Benedict said to the cardinals and just speculate of it almost as a performance of art, you could say. Perhaps his greatest performance, certainly the most dramatic. Having repeatedly examined my conscience before God, me and God, no one else, with full freedom I declare that I renounce the ministry of Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter. What is eros? What is art? This has some clues, so I claim. Afterwards, if you read in the media, there are at least 17 conspiracies about him being sick, about him being run out by the liberals, about the, this faction driving him out, and about how he couldn't get along with so-and-so, and about how he had, over his head with scandals and this and that. None of them to this day have had an ounce of confirmation, unless you're really reading like trash internet stuff and just get off that stuff, right? But there's been no Vatican indication whatsoever that there's any reason for Benedict. And I know some people who that really bothers them. He's totally unaccountable. He just quit. You can't do that. I want you to go back to John Paul II again. I'm linear, but I'm not so linear. And remember what people said whenever he wouldn't quit, when he was frail. They couldn't understand. He's clearly sick. He can't hold his head up. He speaks, in this guttural chest voice because he can't get his head into the microphone. He can't walk. Why doesn't he quit? You may think, oh, these are polar opposites. John Paul II, he held on. He was brave. He had courage. Benedict, he gave in. He's not as, you could be like, oh, he was Polish, so he was tough, and Germans, And I'm just joking. My point is that in some sense, it was the same act in both cases. There was no justification whatsoever. They did what they did in the way that art is what it is. Unaccountable, radically, erotically, even you could say, free. We don't often think, and I'm just saying we within our tradition, and outside of the tradition even more, we don't often think of our tradition as one of radical erotic freedom everywhere, and probably for good reason. But here are very clear pointers, I think, to why it is that we might be able to have this kind of an imagination within, you could say, the highest realms of authority, the highest realm of you might say, everything opposed to freedom, you might say. So now I'd like to move into the fourth movement and just really make some suggestions built upon these movements through considering our most recent popes in light of this idea of pastoral philosophy. My claim really is that what Benedict has done, and that what in some sense Francis is now showing to the world, is that we can't have the passion without passion. There is no such thing as a Christ who dies in a passionate way. And for us to be not just sentimentally unmoved, but moved in a deeper way, in a way that agape itself cannot itself hold all on its own. Self-giving love for the other. We think of Christ in this way as though he was like this calculated good husband, right? Okay, well, I love the world so much, so I'm going to give myself in exchange for them. And that doesn't begin to grasp the depths of what Benedict called the mad eros on the cross. That doesn't begin to comprehend what it means for the Son to doubt the Father. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? That doesn't begin to capture that. And when we look at images, we can see that the artists have this passionate imagination for the cross that in many ways the faithful don't. If you look at Michelangelo's crucifixion, his crucifix, you'll notice one very key feature. Does anyone know what it is? Michelangelo's crucifixion. Jesus is naked. Now, if you know anything about Michelangelo, everyone's naked. But this isn't just everyone. This is Christ, right? Even within the Western imaginary, when we get to the crucifixion, even though it's probably the most biblically accurate to put it, we always want to cover Jesus up, and for good reason. However, there is a sense of passion that is not just erotic sex passion, this, that, and the other, but there's another side of passion, I claim, that we really find in the face of death. And in this case, some of our best sources for writing about this might not be Catholic, but I think when you read the accounts of death within existential, phenomenological, literary, music, art, film, you begin to understand that there's something about death that is pales in comparison to a sexualized eros. And so no passion without the passion means that beauty has to have hands and feet. So when we think about beauty, we think of floating clouds and beautiful, soft and pastels, and I don't know, whatever we think of beauty. We think of beauty as standardized, right? There is a beautiful this, that, and the other. We think of beauty in the digital age as cleaned up, right? All the imperfections taken out. This is not the artistic testament of the cross at all. It's antithetical to the cross. And if you want to find the argument for that and go on to point B. You might say, oh, okay, fine, but the resurrection is the beautiful, where we surpass the cross, where we surpass the descent into hell, where God comes glorious, victorious, glorified, having, rewritten salvation history. This is the moment where we see a beauty that maybe doesn't have to be so bound by this frail body and stuff. Well, look at Caravaggio. Have you ever put your finger in someone's open wound before? I haven't. I think it's gross. I mean, I wouldn't do it. But I can imagine what it would be like. It would be moist. It would feel strange. And this is the sign that Christ uses to confirm his resurrection. He doesn't perform fireworks. He doesn't fly. He says, put your hand in my wounds. So my claim is that this idea that no passion without passion, beauty with hands and feet, is that even the resurrection does not overcome the eros of the wounds of Christ. And when we look at the imagination of the testament of, for example, the Stigmata, it's a kind of strange thing that in our tradition, those most holy are marked not by beauty, floating, they're marked by having to suffer by wearing the wounds of Christ. This goes against, you might say, most people's understanding of beauty, and it's precisely this aesthetic insight, I would say, that makes a little bit more sense of the relationship between art on the one hand and God on the other within an incarnate understanding of what those two things are. Finally, and this gets us more to the way of beauty, is what I want to call the Poetics of Wood. Christ was a carpenter. You might say there's something genius and ironic and tragic about this idea that Christ is born to a carpenter to apprentice a life in which he will end dying on a piece of wood. There's something poetic, you might say, about that. That even the child Christ, in his most innocent stages, holds that piece of wood which prefigures that which he perfectly knows, which is what will be his eventual demise. I have a beautiful painting, which I unfortunately can't remember the author. I told you I'm not an art historian, in my dining room that shows Joseph and Christ working on the bench. And in the back, there's some really abstract kind of painting, but you can see a cross. And it's so beautiful, but it's just heartbreaking. So my claim, though, is that God, art, when we add the incarnation to God, when we add the sort of freedom of art, the eros of art into that, we find ourselves to a way of beauty in which all around us, both within our own tradition and even outside of our tradition, there is a poetics. And when we think about the new evangelization, when we think about testimony, we don't often think of poetry. But why not? I mean, it was good enough for John Paul II, the guy who coined the word new evangelization. He was a poet speaking. It's been good enough for countless amounts of mystics and writers. Teresa of Avila, perhaps the most graphically real, beautiful representation, of course, of Eros and the mystical tradition, the ecstasy of Teresa. If we're living and breathing on apologetics, we're probably starving ourselves. If we're living and breathing on defensive ways of argumentation that win the day and triumph, then we're missing out on what arguably is the most appreciated aspect of the Bible, of Scripture, which is its literary aspects. Many people say, we can't talk about the Bible as literature, and Sean's here. I don't want to say anything about the Bible because I'm scared because he knows way more than I do. But I will venture to say, that in a very lay, non-academic sense, there's no reason why we should throw our noses up in the air when Richard Dawkins says that he likes to read the Bible because the stories are great. This is an entry point, not an exit point. This is something we can share. I love those stories too. When I was a little kid reading David, it was like much more graphic than anything I was allowed to watch. And it was great, you know. It was everything there, you know, blood, sex, everything, adultery. It was awesome. Whenever we think about, you know, the fact that in our hands we have stories, we have parables, in our tradition, you know, I find that I just need to get this off my chest. The idea that music or liturgical music or whatever, the only people who say that all the best art is in the past are people who are not artists. Because to be an artist is to have hope that there can be art today. I feel like right now in the climate of the North American church, there's an almost anesthetic as opposed to aesthetic ethos that has arisen that tends to often try to nostalgically revive the church by appealing to the past. And I love the past. I teach Catholic intellectual tradition here this summer twice. I'm in love with the past. But in a way that cuts the link and the continuity between the past and the present, which is itself arguably a heresy, but it's also just, it doesn't make any sense. My real exhortation, which comes out of Francis's exhortation, is that what we need today are all three kinds of we need artists, like John Paul II. If you're a musician, if you're a poet, if you're a writer, if you're a dancer, if you're a designer, if you cook, if you clean, whatever you do, if you conceptualize, in Spanish we have this beautiful expression, hacer limpieza. It means to make cleanliness. That's art. By the way, for art, I go with Andy Warhol. He says art is whatever you can get away with, right? We need people to work harder to get away with more art in our churches, in our places. And it doesn't just mean Caravaggio, and I love Caravaggio. I'm not criticizing my own parish's selection of art. What I am saying, though, is that we need Caravaggio and everything else. And there is already everything else if we look around, but we could also use more. And so the idea of the Poetics of Wood is an approach to the gospel, an approach to doctrine, an approach to the church, an approach to our everyday lives that doesn't anesthetize itself against a beauty of hands and feet, preferring only the beauty that comes with Italian names and, you know, this, that, and the other. I grew up, this is my last thing before I end, I grew up in a very folk tradition, both in terms of the charismatic renewal, not exactly high church, and my Mexican heritage, which is, there are no organs in the towns where I grew up in. You know, guitars are cheap. And so you make cheap folk music. And if you've ever been to a misa jíbaro, the Puerto Rican version of this, it cooks. I mean, that's where I learned rhythm. That's where I learned the 3/4 clave and the 2/3 clave. That's where I learned music. To this day, I don't know how to read or write music, despite having a PhD. I'm illiterate musically. But I do have this affection for folk music and for this idea of the folk and for folk art in particular. And I see Jesus' parables as forms of folk art. I see the rabbinic tradition in Judaism as a folk tradition that I want to present to you as something value added, not to subtract from other things, that we can all do, because we probably can't do this or that, but there are things we can do. And so I'm going to end by doing this one thing, which is a meditation on the Eros of Augustine whenever he eulogizes his mother, Monica, in the Confessions. It's from a concept album I wrote and performed on the Confessions, and hopefully it's one small way of not just talking about the way of beauty, but maybe even putting it into some kind of practice. So this will be it. If you didn't notice, I'm doing the whole folk Bob Dylan thing here, right? No plugging, all acoustic.
Thank you very much, Sam. We'll just change gears a little bit, and if people would like to ask questions, please come to the front. There are microphones on the sides, and we'd be happy to hear from you.
I did say hi to the YouTube people. Hi, YouTube people. Yeah, and that's why you have to come and talk into the mic so that the YouTube people can hear you.
Right.
Yeah.
Hello, that was a very fine lecture. But is it right that my takeaway is that the radical freedom about art means that art is basically, shall we say, there is no subjectivity to it, that basically anything goes? Is that what you mean?
This is the hard question about art. So no, it's not what I mean, but at prima facie, at first glance, it appears to be what I mean, right? That's what it seems to say, right? So here's where though I have to lean and I have to be very conservative in a very I would say productive way, where Andy Warhol, by the way, was a daily communicant, right? He was, despite what you may think about his work, I don't think much of it, but when he says art is what you can get away with, my claim is you add one more proviso to that. Art is what you can get away with within a community of artists, within a tradition, right? And so for me, within Catholicism, within Roman Catholicism, but also within Christianity or within the religious imagination, or you can go geographic, what those communities look like are different, right? But for instance, if you go and you play a folk song, there's a song, Alabare. Has anybody heard the song Alabare? Alabare, alabare, alabare. If you play that and you're not playing in a 3/4 polka style beat, they'll say, no, that's wrong. Now, are they right or are they wrong about that? Because you're saying, well, can I get away with it? Clearly you can't, right? So I think, I think it's...
You're saying that there should be a freedom from that trigger. In
Yes.
other words, there must be an effectiveness.
Yes,
And
yes.
Ultimately, it's the result. Because I would like to put that in the context, because Pope Benedict did say that the best apologia for the Catholic Church is its saints and its art.
Yes.
And I don't think he was pertaining to that laissez-faire type of result.
No, but let me just be very clear about the fact that for Benedict is not laissez-faire about his art. In fact, you can quote me lots of citations that remind me of this. However, these are his citations about art. But if you read him on eros, when you read him on sort of, you could say, the substructure of reality, my claim is it loosens up a lot of those passages. I also have my own views about art, which are benefited deeply from reading Benedict, but they are a bit different, and perhaps I've leaned some of those in there sneakily, as we do. But yes, no, very good. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah? Hi, Randy.
I don't know if I'm going to articulate very well, but the Protestants think that art distracts.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on Protestant thought and why they seem to, in my opinion, kind of eliminate art?
Okay, so the question is that, let's be generous, certain strands of Protestantism hold the view that art is sort of distracting, and that in some sense beauty itself is sort of all icing and no cake, right? So you have the unadorned. This is really good. I'm going off the cuff here, but I want to say, first of all, in dialogue with what you said, really it's the community. So I actually just don't buy that claim, because the unadorned church is an aesthetic, right? The absence of images is clearly, and if you go and you look at like Dutch Reformed and like you look at like they clearly have developed a sort of, it's kind of like modernism before its time, right? I mean, they have this certain kind of mediumist approach to building and making things, and they carry an intentionality into it. My claim is, okay, we disagree about what we mean about art, but you can't say that your unadorned, minimalist approach is any different than a brutalist architect or whatever. You just have a different aesthetic, and that I would say is in some sense categorically different than what my claims are here. Having said that, If we move in the other direction, our particular Latin Rite Church, I think, has a lot to learn, certainly from Protestants, but especially from our Eastern brothers and sisters who have an entire iconography of art, an entire theology of art, you could say, that is not as particularly as well laid out both theologically and liturgically as ours is. And I think that in many cases, you might think like, oh, this guy's advocating for like folk mass and jazz mass, whatever. I don't know if I'm doing that. But at the same time, if you want to say what experience of liturgy should you go to, I'd probably send you to, a very long Eastern liturgy to just see how that builds. But again, I don't want to put preference on the Dutch Reformed any more than I am on, the Greek Orthodox. But I do want to note that we can make distinctions that are real, despite the fact that I don't buy the idea that anyone's not doing art, right? This is fundamental on my view, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. It was a wonderful talk.
Well, thank you.
One of the topics I've been really interested in is the new evangelization, and I'm also a teacher and educator. And I was wondering, I really enjoyed what you said about how the passion of the cross is visceral and messy, and it makes it very alive, and I really feel that on Good Friday, and we're trying to get that out to message to young people. So how do you think, in terms of what you just spoke about, how do we engage young people with new evangelization, interested in theology and philosophy, using art and their stories and culture, even popular culture, that attracts them?
Sure. I mean, this is probably what I was supposed to be talking on the whole time, right? I have opinions about this clearly, but as you all tell, I'm slippery. They're within a very small range of what I mean by these things I'm trying to say. My claim, this you can find in my book, Folk Phenomenology for Sale in Plato's Cave, is that we need less theories of art and more art. So whenever Francis is asked about art, he just talks about works of art that you can literally go and see or buy or borrow or whatever. And so I think that we've reached a point at which John Paul II made art, and Benedict gave us an ability to appreciate art, I think, that went deeper. What Francis is doing today, and what it would be my response, is that we need to stop trying to figure out how to use art and start making art and start going to see film and start checking out books at the library and start actually engaging in a community and a tradition of art. So if I'm stuck in my folk place, but you don't have to be, right? You can go and find whatever place you're stuck in and find what the community is there. And every parish in this diocese has its own liturgical approach. Some may be qualitatively different than others, but you can offer to that musically. I'm not just talking about music, though. I'm talking about lectures. I'm talking about so many things. I mean, food. My goodness, food. Food matters as a culinary. The culinary arts matter. So, lots of people like food. Maybe we should just eat good food. And I know that takes money and takes resources. Well, there's the project. Maybe we figure out how to do that. So to me, it's really about sort of not over-intellectualizing these things and actually engaging with them in a kind of head-on way. And this corresponds, of course, to my view of pastoral philosophy, which is really not a theoretical project. It's really about sharing stories, and it really happens through art. Last thing I'll say is I hope that this wasn't a sort of accoutrement of the talk. This wasn't meant to be sort of anything but another way of showing what words can't quite say. It wasn't meant, though, to be a kind of bell and whistle or, thing like that. It had a liturgical thing, opening, ending, yeah, I get that. But so hopefully when we use art, though, we're very careful. In fact, I would say there's a lot of art being used in religious contexts that actually uses art, instrumentalizes art, and I would be very careful about those settings, right? So a lot of devotional music being made, besides being underwhelming musically, is also used in a very instrumental way. Oh, it's what the kids like, so let's get a drum set, and and I'm the drummer at this mass in 7 p.m. So I'm not making fun of drums, but if you're not listening to Brian Blade and to people who are serious about the instruments of drums, don't just bang on it because the kids like it, right? That would be my claim. Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'm I'm an artist working in the evangelical church, so
Great.
I appreciate a lot of what you said, especially about this idea of freedom, the ability to do art under a sense of freedom. I think I struggle with this idea of beauty and art. Where does morality come into it? Because I actually don't think that we can affirm everything and call it beautiful just because it's art. So like there does need to be this freedom, but even Augustine himself would say like beauty and goodness kind of go together,
Sure.
right? So yeah, how would you speak to morality and
Good.
beauty?
Yep. So I'm trying to be very narrowly focused in this case. So we have the three transcendentals: truth, beauty, and goodness. I'm giving a class on them in relation to the Catholic intellectual tradition this summer. Truth, beauty, and goodness all matter. I'm not so sure that we quite understand what truth and goodness refer to. Like, goodness isn't moralism, right? It's not just, being nice to people, or it's not altruism, it's not philanthropy, right? It's something else. Truth isn't just mathematical or logical truth, right? There's something deeper to truth. And I think there's also something deeper to beauty. What makes beauty unique, though, I would claim, that's the whole, now the parts. Everything for me is either like together or split, right? So that's the together. The split version, though, is that beauty operates, I would claim, and here I think there's a few people, but not as many, who would probably agree with me, so this might be a contentious claim, is that the law of the good, and in some sense the veracity of the true, are not exhaustive without the beautiful. That the beautiful has a certain sufficiency, and part of what makes that sufficiency what it is precisely its mark of freedom, is precisely the fact that we can't decide in consciousness that when we receive a work of art that maybe you thought my guitar playing was awful, and that's great, because that's what a work of art is free to be, right? This is where taste, there's not taste in goodness and in truth, right? We don't get to say, I have a taste for the principle of non-contradiction, right? We don't get to say, I have a taste for not, cutting off people's fingers with scissors just randomly, right? We don't get to have like appetites for that. But when it comes to beauty, there's wit, there's taste, there's a kind of nuance that in some sense, I would say, adds to the sophistication of the perhaps different logics of the good and of the true. This is difficult, though. I think the reason why beauty has been kind of slept on for 2,000 years is because it in some sense appears prima facie to threaten the order of the good and the order of morality. My claim today, though, is that we need not be afraid of beauty, maybe because we've spent the last 2,000 years on the truth and goodness thing. But I could be wrong, and I think this can be overextended in really dangerous ways. But dangerous ways. This is Pope Francis' call. Get dirty, get messy, be danger, risk, stuff like that. It is dangerous to take beauty to its radical conclusion, which leads you to a kind of nihilistic Nietzschean place. As Benedict shows us, that's a danger. My claim, though, is that it's precisely the risk of beauty that makes it even more important over against. But that, of course, doesn't deny the fact that those risks are also real. And what happens when you lose? It's scary. And art scares me, too, right? And so beautiful should scare you, should shock you, those kinds of things. But no, these are all great questions. These are all balanced in some ways. My kind of over-the-top celebration of art with no control. Is Father up? Oh, man. Don't ask me about biology, please.
Thanks very much for your presentation. In particular, it's pretty uncommon to have eros as such a big part of a conversation about our religious sensibilities. So thanks very much for that. And I'm wondering if the privatization of religion that's happened in the past century takes the storytelling out of it, the narrative, that we lose the capacity to share, and that takes the eros, that takes the flesh out of it. And so is part of the new evangelization to take seriously our own stories and find a way to share them with each other.
This will probably be the last one, right? Okay, so I'm just going to go back to Francis and what's been reiterated throughout this lecture series. And I haven't been able to make all of them, but I made a few enough to know this, and you began, so what a way to end the season. This idea of a church for the poor and of the poor church, I want to be very concrete about this, because it gets, the poor get sentimentalized into these like angelic, people with no money that we give, especially in North America, where our sensibility of the poor is very different than it would be in other places. To concretize Francis's point on the poor in relationship to yours, I don't think it's just a privatization of religion, but it's in some sense the gentrification of religion. So in Mexico, at the end of Mass, when the priest kind of starts moving off the altar, people flood the front because they want him to bless anything. They got new shoes, medals, their arm, what anything and everything. It's become, when you look at it, you're like, these poor people, they can't afford anything else. This is free. They just run up there and get some free water, and you could be very vulgar about it, but there's something about the eros of that moment that it's out of control. There's no ushers. It's kind of dangerous. And the recessional song is over, and the priest is still awkwardly on the altar. It's become ritualized. It's become a part of the liturgy now. It's become ordered. In other words, now there are people. Now they know. Okay, you can rush the altar, but you have to stay there. Okay. In other words, to me, it's the fact that within, in particular, a North American, Western European gentrified experience of faith and religion, we've really lost the eros of the poor. And so when Francis says that we need to be a church for the poor and of the poor, when he says we need to be a poor church, I think he doesn't just mean we need to be charitable and nice and altruistic and all those things. I think what he means is that we need to regain this erotic thing about religion that exists in the global South and other places that seems markedly absent in our own. We're on the West End, Vancouver. What else do we call it, right? Our own communities, and this is where I think the folk sensibility comes in. This is where I think that story. It's hard to share a story if there isn't a structure around it to be shared in those ways. And so I would say that that's part of it. I mean, very concretely, and this is what I'll end on. Hopefully, we need to let kids make some noise and Mass. I mean, talk about a gentrified church where children aren't. I mean, we think. I mean, this is a problem. I have 3 kids. They're not always very quiet in church, nor should they be. Children are erotic creatures. They do as they please sometimes. Now, I don't think as a parent that I should just let everything go and never. But I do think there are points in which if the child is 1.5, there are limits to what I can do. They are a work of art, very close to their natality, to their birth. They are in God's freedom to yell and scream and let excrement fly and whatever else they want to in church, right? So it's not just about a church for the poor and of the poor. It's also a childlike church. And so I think these are concrete ways, though, that we can think about sort of the problem beyond the privatized and into the more, I would say, cutting question of gentrification, whatever that means. But thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it so much. Yeah. And thank you, Linda. Yeah.
Thank you all for being here, both physically and those who are here virtually. I'd just like a couple of closing things, to invite you to a reception. We can continue the conversation in Plato's Cave, just outside in the next building. If you haven't done it already, and if you've never done it, please take a moment to fill out a contact card and drop it off at the front, and then we can tell you about future lectures. The next lecture series will start in September 15th, actually. Bishop Remy Deroux, the Emeritus Bishop of Victoria, will be talking to us about his experiences at Vatican II. So that'll be interesting. At the reception, some of Sam's books and CDs will be for sale. If you're interested, please help yourself. We also have flyers for our summer programs around, and as Sam said, he'll be teaching one of the classes. So thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
No, it isn't, is it?